March 17, 1945. Western Germany. 05 for 7 hours. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Cologne like a burial shroud. Through the mist, the twin spires of the cathedral rose skeletal and blackened against a sky that had forgotten the color of peace. The air tasted of brick dust and cordite, of ancient mortar ground to powder beneath tank treads, of a civilization collapsing one stone at a time. In the rubble of what had been a bakery and hostelry, a German sniper adjusted his position among the fallen timbers. His rifle, a carabiner 98K with a Zeiss scope, rested on a shattered windowsill that once framed a view of bustling market life. Now it framed only devastation. He did not move. He did not need to. The Americans would come. They always came. And he would wait, as he had been trained to wait, as the doctrine demanded he wait, until the moment was perfect, until the engineers came to finish what the bombers had begun. This was not the war the Wehrmacht had imagined when they marched into Poland nearly 6 years earlier. This was not the lightning victory, the swift conquest, the triumphant parade through subjugated capitals. This was something else entirely. This was the slow death of a nation that had staked everything on the mythology of invincibility, now reduced to fighting from cellars and sewers from the broken bones of cities that once symbolized German cultural achievement. The sniper in the rubble was not defending territory anymore. He was defending a ghost. But ghosts, as the Americans would learn, could still kill. The strategic situation by March 1945 had become a mathematical certainty that even the most fanatical Nazi could not deny, though many tried. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River and stood less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, American and British forces had breached the Siegfried Line and were pouring across the Rhine. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies, her industrial capacity shattered by years of strategic bombing, her manpower exhausted by losses that had consumed an entire generation. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German military innovation, had been swept from the skies. The Kriegsmarine lay rusting at the bottom of the Atlantic. What remained was an army of old men and children, equipped with weapons that grew scarcer each day, defending a regime that had led them to the edge of annihilation. Yet in the rubble of German cities, a peculiar phenomenon emerged that confounded American commanders and contradicted every rational military calculation. As Allied forces advanced into urban areas that should have been indefensible, they encountered resistance that seemed to intensify rather than collapse. German soldiers, who by all logic should have surrendered or retreated, instead burrowed deeper into the ruins and fought with a desperation that bordered on the suicidal. They did not fight for territorial gain. They did not fight for strategic advantage. They fought because the alternative, witnessing the complete destruction of everything they had known, was somehow more unbearable than death itself. The German sniper doctrine of 1945 reflected this grim reality. It was not the doctrine of a confident army seeking battlefield dominance. It was the doctrine of trapped men who understood that time was their only remaining weapon. Wehrmacht training manuals from this period, recovered after the war, reveal a tactical philosophy built entirely around delay. Snipers were instructed to select positions in structures that appeared already destroyed, to avoid engaging targets until American combat engineers and demolition teams began their work of systematic urban clearance. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Kill the soldiers trying to make the city passable. Force the Americans to slow down, to bring up more resources, to expend more time. Every hour delayed was an hour that perhaps, and possibly, might allow for some political miracle, some negotiated peace that would preserve something of Germany from total destruction. What these German soldiers expected, what their propaganda had told them to expect, was an enemy driven by vengeance and hatred. They had been told that American forces, particularly those accompanied by Soviet liaisons or Jewish refugees serving as translators, would execute prisoners without trial, would rape and pillage with the savagery of Asiatic hordes. This was the language of Goebbels' final broadcasts. They expected the Americans to match the brutality that German forces had inflicted across Europe, to bring fire and sword, and make no distinction between soldier and civilian. In this expectation, the German sniper waiting in the ruins of Cologne was prepared for a battle to the death because surrender seemed to promise only a different form of death. What they actually experienced shattered this carefully constructed worldview as thoroughly as Allied bombs had shattered their cities. When American combat engineers of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion rolled into the outskirts of Cologne that March morning, they came not only with weapons but with bulldozers, with cranes, with prefabricated bridge sections and road grading equipment. They came with a logistical apparatus so vast and so incomprehensibly wealthy in resources that it seemed to operate by rules that violated everything the German military mind understood about warfare. A single American engineering company carried more construction equipment than an entire German pioneer division. They had trucks carrying spare parts for machines that carried spare parts. They had maps printed on waterproof paper, updated weekly by aerial reconnaissance. They had portable radio sets that weighed less than a German field telephone and could communicate across 50 miles. And they had food. God in heaven, they had food. This was the symbolic object that would haunt German soldiers more than any weapon, more than any tank or artillery piece. Food, not the ersatz coffee and black bread that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years. Not the dwindling rations that by 1945 had left German soldiers genuinely hungry even in rear areas. The Americans had food that seemed to come from some parallel universe, where the word rationing had no meaning. See rations packed with cigarettes, chocolate, tinned meat, fruit cocktail, sugar, real coffee. Every American soldier carried more food in his pack than a German soldier saw in a week. Prisoners taken in the initial advances into German territory reported this with the bewilderment of men describing something beyond their conceptual framework. One captured Obergefreiter, interrogated by the 104th Infantry Division in February 1945, kept returning to the subject of American rations. His testimony recorded in the division's intelligence summary. They eat from tins while riding in trucks. They throw away food we would have fought over. This is not an army. This is a nation that has moved itself across an ocean. The German sniper in Cologne washed through his scope as the American engineers began their methodical work. They did not charge forward with rifles blazing. They surveyed the street with instruments mounted on tripods. They marked debris with colored stakes. They worked with the calm efficiency of men building a highway because, in essence, that was exactly what they were doing, building a highway through the corpse of his city. A Sherman bulldozer, its blade scarred by contact with 1,000 obstacles, rumbled forward and began pushing rubble into an organized pile. The blade caught a fragment of stone that had once been part of a Renaissance-era merchant house, shoved it aside with the indifference of industrial machinery encountering organic matter. Behind the bulldozer, a truck waited with a crane attachment, ready to lift larger obstacles that could not be pushed. The sniper's finger rested on the trigger. Not yet. The doctrine was clear. Wait until the engineers were committed. Wait until they'd brought up their specialized equipment, the devices that could not be easily replaced. Wait until the Americans believed the area was secure enough to work without constant vigilance. The German military, stripped of everything else, still possessed patience born of desperation. But the Americans had learned. They had learned in Aachen, in Metz, in every contested urban space from Normandy onward. They advanced with a methodology that reflected an understanding of war as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a contest of heroic wills. Before the bulldozer had moved 50 meters, a squad of infantry established positions in the buildings across the street, their Browning automatic rifles trained on every window, every pile of rubble large enough to hide a man. Behind them, a half-track mounting a .50 caliber machine gun took up a position that commanded the entire street. The American doctrine had evolved in response to German tactics, had absorbed the lessons of urban combat and codified them into standard operating procedures. Where Germans fought as individuals armed with cunning and desperation, Americans fought as a system, each component supporting the others, the whole greater than any sum of its parts. At 0612 hours, the German sniper fired. His first shot struck an American sergeant directing the bulldozer operation, the round entering just below the rim of the man's helmet and killing him before his body understood it was dead. The crack of the rifle echoed through the empty streets like a hammer striking glass. Immediately, the American response demonstrated the gap between expectation and reality. The bulldozer did not retreat, it surged forward, its driver dropping below the armored cowling while the blade rose to provide additional protection. The infantry did not scatter in panic. They marked the general direction of the shot and returned fire with a volume that would have consumed a German unit's daily ammunition allotment. In 30 seconds, the .50 caliber opened up, its heavy rounds chewing through brick and mortar with a sound like the world's largest zipper being torn open. Tracer rounds drew orange lines through the morning mist, seeking the source of that single shot. The sniper had already displaced, crawling through a pre-planned route that took him through a collapsed wall into the cellar of the adjacent building. This was the other half of the doctrine: shoot and move, never remain in position. Make each shot cost the Americans time and caution. He could hear the Americans calling to each other in their flat, nasal accents. He could hear the rumble of more vehicles moving up. He had bought perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps 20. In the calculus of March 1945, this counted as a tactical victory, but the Americans did not simply suppress the sniper position with fire and continue working. They stopped, they consolidated, and they called forward a piece of equipment that represented everything about American warfare that made it so alien to European military tradition. An for Sherman tank mounting a dozer blade arrived, accompanied by another tank fitted with a flame projector, the Zippo, as the crews called it, or officially the M4A3R3. The American commander, a captain whose name the German sniper would never know, made a decision that reflected a doctrine entirely different from anything in German military experience. If the building contains an enemy, remove the building. The systematic destruction that followed was not the passionate destruction of men in combat frenzy. It was methodical, almost bureaucratic. The Sherman with the dozer blade positioned itself and began pushing against the base of the building where the sniper had fired from. The structure, already weakened by previous bombing, groaned and shifted. Engineers placed demolition charges at load-bearing points, working with the casual competence of men who had performed this task 100 times before. When the charges detonated, the building collapsed inward with a roar that drowned out all other sound, sending up a cloud of dust that turned the morning light amber. The Zippo tank then methodically sprayed burning fuel into the rubble, ensuring that any cellars or tunnels would become uninhabitable. The German sniper, watching from his new position 2 buildings away, understood with perfect clarity that the Americans were not trying to kill him specifically. They were erasing the environment that made his tactics possible. Historical records from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion describe this day's work with the bland precision of an after-action report. Encountered sniper fire at 0612. 1 Kia, Tuwaya, reduced suspected sniper positions in grid square 447,823. Continued clearance operations. Roadway secured by 1430 hours. Bridging equipment moved forward as scheduled. This sterile language concealed a profound truth that German military theorists would struggle with in the post-war years. The Americans had industrialized combat itself. They did not fight battles in the European sense of the term, as discrete contests of military skill. They processed battlefield problems with the same systematic approach they applied to manufacturing automobiles. Encounter an obstacle, apply overwhelming resources, remove obstacle, proceed to next phase. The German sniper fired twice more that day, achieving one additional casualty before American counter-sniper teams equipped with their own scoped Springfield rifles and supported by artillery observers who could call down 105 mm fire on suspected positions made his situation untenable. By mid-afternoon, he withdrew deeper into the city, moving through the cellars and tunnels that connected buildings, a subterranean world that had become the last refuge of German resistance. He was 19 years old, a veteran of 6 months, whose original unit had been destroyed in the Ardennes. He knew 14 men who had started the war with parade marches through cheering crowds. 11 were dead, 2 were missing, 1 had lost both legs to a mine. The carabiner he carried had belonged to his squad leader, dead since January. The 15 rounds in his pouches represented 3 days of waiting for resupply that never came. That evening, in a cellar beneath a destroyed pharmacy, he shared a tin of preserved meat with 2 other soldiers. The tin had been American, taken from a captured supply truck weeks earlier. They ate in silence, savoring food that tasted of industrial plenty, of a nation that could afford to ship canned beef across an ocean, while their own country slaughtered horses in the streets of Berlin for meat. One of the soldiers, a Feldwebel who had fought in France in 1940, spoke quietly about the propaganda they had been fed, about the promises of secret weapons and political collapse in the Allied coalition. He spoke about the gap between what they had been told to expect and what they had encountered. "They are not cruel," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of comprehension that was almost philosophical. "That is what makes this unbearable. If they were cruel, we could hate them properly, but they are simply thorough. They have so much of everything that they can afford to waste it on mercy." This observation cut to the heart of the ideological crisis that American abundance created in the German military mind. Nazi ideology had been built on the concept of struggle, of hardship creating strength, of the master race being forged in the fire of deprivation and conflict. The Americans violated this entire framework by being strong without hardship, victorious without the purified suffering that was supposed to create military virtue. They ate well, they slept in tents with cots, they received mail from home with packages containing luxuries. They fought a war as if it were an inconvenient job to be completed efficiently so they could return to lives of unimaginable comfort. Their strength came not from ideological purity or racial superiority but from factories, from an economic system that produced so much wealth that it could afford to arm half the world while raising its own standard of living. The historical record documents this cognitive dissonance in hundreds of prisoner interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers in the final months of the war. German soldiers expressed bewilderment, anger, resentment, but beneath these emotions ran a current of something closer to despair, the recognition that they had been lied to not just about the course of the war, but about the fundamental nature of their enemy. They had been told they were fighting decadent plutocracies that would collapse under pressure. Instead, they found themselves fighting a plutocracy so strong that its decadence took the form of giving ordinary soldiers waterproof watches and insulated boots. They had been told that democracy made nations weak. Instead, they faced an enemy whose democratic industrialism had created a military machine that processed them like wheat through a thresher. Over the following days, the pattern repeated across Cologne and in 100 other German cities. Snipers fired from the ruins, and the Americans simply erased the buildings they hid in. It was warfare as demolition. Industry turned into combat. The Americans never slowed, never ran out of fuel, food, or ammunition. They weren't an army in the old sense. They were industrial power given human form. When Cologne finally fell on March 19th, the victors didn't bring vengeance. They brought food. Spam, powdered milk, chocolate bars stamped U.S. Army. Starving civilians who had been told to expect barbarity instead received generosity. The Americans fed their enemies better than the right fed its own soldiers. That simple act of abundance shattered faith in Nazi ideology more effectively than any speech or broadcast could. A German sniper surrendered 2 days later. He walked out of a cellar, left his rifle behind, and told his interrogator, "We were told we were the master race. But you had bulldozers. What ideology can compete with that?" Across Germany, the same realization spread. Men who had believed in discipline, sacrifice, and purity saw that courage meant nothing against machines that never stopped coming. The Americans had not won through genius or myth but through logistics, through a system that turned freedom and wealth into an unstoppable force. Cologne was rebuilt from the rubble with American aid and German labor. The same soldiers who once fought now cleared debris fed by rations from the same army that had destroyed their city. The cathedral stood amid the ruins, a survivor among ghosts, restored later with American loans. Slowly, a new Germany rose, fed, funded, and rebuilt by the same abundance that had crushed the old one. For those who lived through it, the lesson was unmistakable. Freedom, whatever its flaws, produced wealth. Democracy, for all its inefficiency, created strength. And that wealth, organized and industrialized, destroyed an empire built on myth. The transformation was not born of ideology but necessity. Germans embraced democracy not because they loved it but because they had seen what abundance could do. They remembered the chocolate bars, the Spam tins, the soldiers who gave food instead of cruelty. They chose prosperity over purity, plenty over pride. Somewhere beneath modern Cologne, under cafes and offices, a sniper's rifle still lies buried, a relic of a world that believed power came from deprivation. Above it stands the proof that abundance wins. The bulldozers that once crushed the city built it again, stronger than before. That was the final victory, not the destruction of an army, but the defeat of an idea. The war ended not only on the battlefield but in the minds of those who saw that democracy's greatest weapon was not ideology, but the simple, overwhelming power of plenty.